Hello everyone, it's Wordup here again, and I'm here today with another more up-to-date look at Legion Enhancement. Since my last video series, there's been quite a few changes, so I'm going to be splitting this up into two different sections. First, I'll be taking a look at what's different since I last covered the spec, and also whether said changes are for the better or for the worse, including talents, baseline abilities, and their general feel on the alpha so far. Second, I'll be finally getting down to a look at some suggestions as to what could improve. These are going to be a mix of gameplay aspects, talent changes, and likely we'll also dip a bit into the infamous class fantasy debate that's been going on right now. Starting off then with the big baseline changes that have happened, let's take a look at Stormlash. The spell now finally scales and has its own fancy animation, as obnoxious as it sometimes can be, firing off from everywhere and everyone who's been buffed, and it seems to be contributing a small amount of damage in group play. There was a lot of worries about how this would work, and without getting into the nitty-gritty of the mechanics math and the tools that make it work, it does seem like the target of the proc doesn't make a great deal of difference as to its overall output, and it also scales directly from the source shaman's stats, so you shouldn't be worried about it hitting, say, a low-geared player and not getting the same effect. This, however, does all link together to make it a quite boring, flat damage proc no matter where it goes, and is completely out of our control with no interactivity. And by that measure then, it does fulfill the offensive buff fantasy, but it's not so much an exciting mechanic, sadly. Next, I'm going to tackle the big one, which is a recent jump from Shamanistic Rage as the baseline defensive cooldown over to Astral Shift. There's already a lot of rumblings about enhancement survivability concerns, which I personally don't fully agree with if you've seen me anywhere around on the forums. However, I can definitely see why people have concerns dropping down to only one singular method of damage reduction compared to what we have now. The switch over to Astral Shift then feels like a big kick in the teeth to the feedback regarding that. Increasing the DIR effect overall by 25%, but in exchange dropping the uptime if used routinely from 25% to just under 7%. Obviously, you don't use your defensives on cooldown, but it makes it less available and far less versatile, which is the most important tool or design aspect of a defensive cooldown. This change then, I must say I strongly disagree with for endgame in nearly every aspect. Unless there is going to be some extraneous factor added to Astral Shift to make it more flexible, it just is a flat out nerf. Feral Spirit has lost the 50% haste bonus for 30 seconds after cast, in exchange for each wolf hit generating 10 Maelstrom, as opposed to just a flat 5 per second. Whilst the 50% haste wasn't ideal, as it was almost guaranteed to lead to haste evaluation, it gave the cooldown strong personal impetus compared to the base wolf damage. Sadly, the shift to this increase in Maelstrom has just led to a colossal flood that cannot be spent, and strongly discourages stacking it up with Doom Winds. There seems to be a disconnect now, as Maelstrom is nowhere near as valuable enough to justify this as our only cooldown, and more importantly, the sheer amount wasted at the very least feels like it's never getting its full power realised, which will only get worse with gear. A quick note also, before I move on to the talents, is that Lightning Bolt now is no longer scaling up and given a Maelstrom consumption aspect. It's not a big change, and it does just turn it completely into a pulling tool, not considering taking, say, Stormbringer. Stormstrike has also received a cost reduction and a damage buff, which simply cements it more as a finisher and a spend as soon as possible, whilst not being too punishing during those Stormfury procs on your resource, especially if you're using Tempest. Next, let's take a quick overview of talent changes since my last overview on them. First tier, both Windsong and Fists of Stone got some pretty significant changes to bring them more in line. Windsong is now a 45-second cooldown for only 20% attack speed instead of 50, and whilst this still syncs with Doom Winds, the bonus feels a lot more hollow as a few of the cooldown stacking mechanics that we had in the first pass have gone at the same time. So ultimately, it does feel like a bit of an overnerf to the ability. Fists of Stone, however, lost all of its negatives, had its cooldown dropped down to 15, generates 30 Maelstrom when used, and is off the global cooldown, which are all fantastic changes to move it up to the talent that I like the most on the tier. Having a reliable active surge of Maelstrom with a bonus buff attached to it is a great change, and now makes it fit on a tier with Resonance and Windsong. Lightning Shield has now shifted to a purely passive damage source. Whilst this has impeded complexity a little bit by removing the smart Maelstrom use and managing the cooldown properly, this is probably for the better with current design. Sadly, regardless of these changes, it's still worse than the alternatives and has turned the talent tier into 2 completely passive buffs and 1 semi-passive, which seems like a poor change. Newly added talent Stormbringer seems to be there to rekindle the Ward or Mop design mechanically, but the damage output of Lightning Bolt seems so weak in comparison to Stormstrike that there's little to really encourage it other than dilute an already very busy rotation. Fury of Air changes to nerf it down a little and fix the scaling bugs whilst giving it a toggle is a great change for me and provides a source of consistent AoE damage without the worry to be forced into using it for single target. It also gives a lot more flexibility in encounters, and the tier it is now placed on makes for a solid, variable choice depending on the encounter. Jumping then straight into the single target alternative is Hailstorm, which, tuning issues aside, presents an interesting addition as an elementally imbued spec. It's too similar to Flame Tongue for me, but given the incentive to actively cast a frost spell to buff our attacks up is very interesting to have that trifecta. This could be explored further by altering either Hailstorm or Flame Tongue's mechanics to differentiate them, but I like that there is the option to go all in on the self-buff dynamic, making us similar in a sense to, say, a melee Affliction Warlock, buffing up our attacks through a variety of buffs as opposed to debuffing our enemy. Empowered Stormlash now occupies a tier with Hailstorm and Fury of Air, effectively replacing Spiritual Affinity, which is now removed, and Crushing Storm, which is now moved up to 100. With the recent Feral Spirit nerfs, this isn't as significant as, say, the big damage boost from the haste buff being removed, but beefing up Stormlash as a replacement, which is already quite a dull mechanic, feels very hollow. I'd hope that this doesn't become the go-to talent simply because of fantasy and numbers, as the other options on the tier are far more interactive and quite a lot more interesting. Ascendance has had its duration cut in half and dropped back to basically being the exact same as on live. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's now far less of an overt benefit to take it compared to both other options in their respective strong situations. At the very least though, having the choice to opt in or out to a burst cooldown as a talent is a good thing despite losing the Stormstrike reset on cast, which is a significant nerf. Crashing Storm has thankfully received a huge overhaul and now adds a small consecration effect after a successful Crash Lightning cast, regardless of target's hit. Positional issues aside of mobs moving out of the area and potential overscaling due to each hit proccing Stormlash at the moment, this was a great change. Adding a passive AoE aspect to the typically more active spell in Crash Lightning gives a good amount of versatility and provides a strong option in the final tier to beef up our AoE coupled with Fury of Air on the other tiers, because it's typically been a tier that is purely single target. So that just about covers the more significant changes that have happened since my initial analysis with those 3 videos. So now I'm finally going to get around to making a few possible suggestions to smooth out the spec, its talent tree, or tweak some mechanics that I feel are a lot less intuitive than they could be. First and absolutely foremost, if the new Feral Spirit change is to be final, Enhancement requires an increase to its Maelstrom cap or some kind of overflow mechanic. A cap could be done in a variety of ways, for example, a talent or a bonus tacked onto one of the passives, such as Ancestral Swiftness, or simply an artifact trait perk granting extra per point. An overflow mechanic, alternatively, is a bit more interesting, but potentially has the room to undermine the resource management gameplay if it scales too well. An example of implementation, however, would be, say, a bonus to the Lightning Shield talent, in which any Maelstrom generated past the cap discharges for a small amount onto targets around you, so those periods of unspendable generation a la Doomwinds or Feral Spirit don't feel quite as punishing. And finally, the third solution is to provide a tool accessible in some way that allows us to turn into a full resource dump mode, so during surges we have a way to burn off the excess aggressively. Admittedly, past iterations of this for other classes, such as, say, Warrior with the Inner Rage mechanic in Cataclysm, was quite unintuitive and quite daunting for the new player, so I'm unsure that this would be the ideal solution compared to the other two. I'm just laying it out there. Linking to that then, the Feral Spirit iteration this patch doesn't in any way feel like a good cooldown to press. Even in periods of high spend, it still leads to a big burst of unspendable resource compared to previous patches where the buff still led to a cap, but was less of an instant surge and more of a slow burn that had a bit more room to be used. Losing the self buff as well feels very significant, though it's entirely reasonable due to hasty valuing. It just seems like an underwhelming button press now, as well as themselves deal extremely poor damage, and perhaps the solution would be to either buff up their actual hit damage, or allow them to grant us an admittedly dull but useful flat damage buff, or finally, the more extreme, be to have their attacks go back to only generating 5, but grant us increased mastery for more frequent storm strikes, or increased lava lash damage to burn off that excess maelstrom power, and ultimately allow us to have Doom Winds usable while they're active without feeling like it's a huge waste of resources that we could be using elsewhere. Jumping ahead then, the trifecta of Landslide, Flametongue and Hailstorm is a great idea in my eyes, and it should definitely be kept in some way. However, Hailstorm and Flametongue both operate exactly the same. Obviously, one is significantly better due to tuning, but bar the elemental type, they are mechanically identical, sans the Maelstrom cost of Hailstorm. Given that Landslide is different and has different effects as a self-buff, I believe that Hailstorm should also have some form of different effect compared to the alternatives. That could be done in any manner of ways to just make it feel like it's a different buff and a different spellcast. Be that, for example, a simple solution of simply being a buff that stacks, which detonates at, say, 5 stacks for damage, or potentially making Storm Fury procs more likely while active and make those Storm Strikes that consume Storm Fury deal frost damage, giving a synergistic effect with, say, the Tempest talent. Moving on quickly to something different then, the new Artifact passive has lost the triple benefit on different weapon enhancement casts, and now solely has kept the Rockbiter effect Earthen Might. This is a shame because it was arguably the least interesting of the 3 procs, and I think that at the very least, Lava Dredger from Flametongue should be a passive attached to the offhand weapon. But Earthen Might needs to be less dull given how iconic the passives are becoming for the other artifacts. Perhaps if it mimicked Rockbiter while it was active in both damage and generation, or possibly simply allow auto attacks to instead deal elemental damage whilst the proc is active, could be the routes to go down. Staying on the artifact then, a number of the traits currently seem quite uninteresting, though some can yet be tested, so this could possibly be slightly inaccurate. All 3 of the major Golden Dragon traits that exist don't seem that exciting mechanically, though they definitely appear to have a distinct visual flair. The only reachable one, as of now, is Doomwolves, doesn't do anything, and is also the most ambiguous from data mining information, so that will be exempt from this section. Unleash Doom and Doom Vortex based on numbers and the flat mechanics tied to them, in particular Doom Vortex encouraging Lava Lash when so much elsewhere wants to push Stormstrike, could create a disconnect in the combat flow. Arguably, the 2 most appealing traits sadly aren't even majors, Hurricane and Storm Flurry, as they directly influence Stormstrike, which is the crux at the moment of the spec, are absolutely superior. Our 2 defensive traits in the Healing Surge output boost and the Heal on Shamanistic Rage both seem very underwhelming. Whether Fueled by Rage will be changed following the Astral Shift swap remains to be seen, but currently neither of them seem to me like they'll have a big impact on endgame survivability, which is where the artifact traits seem to be geared toward for other specs. Instead, maybe having absorb shields generated by ability casts, or having a 0 out of 1 trait that grants an extra charge to our defensive tool, whatever that may be, would be more versatile and interesting for the spec. To make room for this, the Alpha Wolf trait could be merged with Doomwolves for that extra slot. Next, I'm going to flip back to the talent tree and talk more in depth about another buzzword quickly, which is synergy. There's a couple of classes on the Alpha currently that have talents that sync extremely well with a set of other talents in their tree, creating specific but variable builds. We had this to some extent originally with Resonance and Affinity and potentially even Kin if it was tuned properly at the time, but as of now, most of our talents are very much either single target, AoE, or a versatile mix of both. Admittedly, this is not a bad thing, and it also allows for picking and choosing a mix of said talents to be useful at different target numbers over the course of a fight, and opt in or out of the most efficient tools depending on the job. However, I'm noting on this because having 5 tiers entirely focused on damage with nothing intrinsically linked with each other based on the tier that you're using them on, but just flat number increases, may be a little bit overkill. In that vein then, excluding the specific talents that I mentioned earlier and discussed, I'd like to present a few alternative paths the tree could take. First off, Feral Lunge, whilst a great thematic ability pulled straight from HOTS, no less from our good pal Rhaegar, requiring a full GCD setup is just simply not feasible even with the damage component. Instead, tying this into Gust of Wind that ports us forward and puts us into Ghost Wolf as we land on the same 15-second cooldown may be more applicable for the talent. In exchange, for losing a talent as an option, this could have a defensive choice, perhaps reintegrating Shamanistic Rage for enhancement as an opt-in, which would make the Astral Shift swap less painful. The mobility tier, in fact, overall is quite superfluous with the CC tier, given how specific the applications are of the various CC tools available. Lightning Surge still feels like a pretty poor utility stun. There are two ways to bring this up though. The first would be an active detonation, in which it stores up a stun, and the detonation that you press stuns relative to the time spent charging, e.g. a 2-second charge equals a 2-second stun. The second will be moving Sundering from its place, remove the displacement and grant it an AoE stun, perhaps at the same time dropping the Maelstrom cost or significantly reducing it, and definitely losing the high damage it now has, to turn it into a utility stun tool for enhancement only. Looking further at that tier, Voodoo and Earthgrab also have very similar applications, so perhaps if we combine all of these suggestions together, you could instead have the CC tier change to be more utility, with an AoE stun option, a Voodoo totem, and a Windrush choice. The mobility tier then could be repurposed to be a more versatile mobility/defense tier that would have Shamanistic Rage, the aforementioned combination of Gust/Lunge, and a final talent that would perhaps reduce damage taken whilst the Ghost Wolf by 15% and increase the movement speed bonus by an additional 15%. This gives you variety in tools to focus on mobility, defense, or a combination of both. I provided an annotation and a link below for a quick mock-up of what this tree change could look like visually, number tuning aside obviously for suggestions. Segueing then into Sundering, as I've already mentioned it, given it's quite a big impactful spell effect, and that I don't have an immediate replacement on the tier it's on to present, it needs a bump to be a better tool compared to the alternatives. This could be done via having a small CDR effect via Rockbiter casts, including the aforementioned Doomhammer passive change, to make it more interactive and competitive for burst AoE. It also definitely needs a glyph of some sort to remove the displacement, e.g. instead causing a 1-second knockdown. Lastly, the final big problem talent at the moment that I'd like to discuss is Ascendance. It's absolutely an iconic ability from Mop, rest in peace Stormblast, as it did fix the massive problem that Enhancement had with having no cooldowns. But it's just not got the gusto anymore to be a top tier talent currently. My primary concern with it, as I've seen echoed in a number of places, is that losing it baseline and shifting it to talents now only granted the extra benefit of the passive Maelstrom gen. This feels like a pretty terrible trade-off, as now Earthen Spike and Crashing Storm, which are competitors, both have applicable, consistent reasons to be used without any real negatives of losing or overcapping or wasting Maelstrom while doing so. This is something I touched on earlier regarding Feral Spirits, in that Maelstrom power simply per point is not as valuable as it needs to be if every cooldown is going to be focused on granting extra Maelstrom. Alleviating this, again, as explained before, is as simple as raising the cap or making Maelstrom waste less brutal than it currently is, that being having an overflow or a way to dump Maelstrom aggressively when these things happen. But having Feral Spirits, Doom Winds, and Ascendants all have a direct impact on Maelstrom generation as severe as it is, as their core bonus seem to clash far too often, and on top of that are quite uninteresting if that's their primo tool. Solutions to this for Ascendants, whilst a little cliche and not very well thought out, I admit, would simply be to take it back to Mop Ascendants, granting us mastery scaling on hits whilst removing the Maelstrom power generation. It clearly did become a problem for Burst going into WoD from Mop. Given that HP pool differences and advances to the PvP system are coming, however, this should no longer be as significant anymore. The only other real change I could suggest on this was something that I did suggest early on going into Legion, which would be to have Ascendance as a toggle that drains Maelstrom whilst active, but allow us to be briefly ranged with a penalty while still ignoring armor. But that is a much more significant mechanical jump on tuning and balance. So that's yet another video down on Legion enhancement changes. Whilst I'm positive I've missed a bit overall on some talents that maybe some were interested in, I've had a bit of a busy month, sadly, so I've had to rush to catch up with some of it. So apologies for the delay on that. I'm in the process of gathering up some dungeon footage to get that out there for all of the ones that were asking and requesting for that stuff to be there. And I have a few more forthcoming videos over the next couple of weeks. They're a bit less talky, alongside the supplementary feedback doc that's in the works. Thanks to everyone who watched and listened to me ramble for what is 20 minutes now. And if you enjoy this kind of stuff, please hit like and subscribe. It helps a lot to get this stuff out there. And I'll see you in the next video.